The deed was folded inside a dead man's boot, and nobody in Redemption Creek, Texas, had thought to look there until the day Inez Bishop found herself standing between two loaded rifles with nowhere left to run. The year was 1882, and the Panhandle had been baking under a merciless July sun for 3 weeks straight without a drop of rain. The land itself seemed angry, cracked, and thirsting, as though the earth knew something the people living on it had not yet figured out. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that existed because it had to, not because anyone had particularly wanted to build it there. It sat along a tributary of the Canadian River like a knot in a rope, with a main street made of packed caliche, a livery stable that smelled of old hay and regret, a dry goods store, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, and a saloon called the Buckhorn that stayed open longer than the church kept its doors unlocked. Inez Bishop had come to Redemption Creek 6 months earlier, after the death of her father, Rufus Bishop, who had staked a claim on 400 acres of grassland east of town back in 1874. She was 24 years old, with dark hair the color of turned earth after a rain, and gray eyes that people often mistook for cold until she smiled and made them realize they had simply misjudged depth for distance. She had been teaching school in Amarillo when the telegram reached her, and she had buried her father in the red soil he loved before anyone could tell her what she had inherited along with his debts and his dreams. What Rufus Bishop had left her was more complicated than she understood at first. The land itself was beautiful, rolling grassland with a creek cutting through the southern quarter, cottonwood trees standing along its banks like tired old sentinels. There was a modest ranch house, a barn in reasonable repair, and about 40 head of cattle that her father had been growing slowly, carefully, the way a man grows something he believes in. Inez had known from the beginning that keeping the ranch would not be easy. What she had not known was that two of the most powerful men in Palo Duro County both believed, with complete conviction, that her land belonged to them. Luther Crane was 51 years old and built like a cottonwood himself, tall and thick-trunked, with a face weathered to the consistency of old saddle leather. He ran the Crane Cattle Company from a sprawling ranch house 3 miles north of the Bishop property, and he employed 11 cowboys, 2 cook hands, and a man named Deacon Price, whose only official job was to make people understand that Luther Crane was not a man you disagreed with more than once. Luther had shown up at Inez's door 2 weeks after her father's funeral with his hat in his hands and a land survey in his coat pocket. He claimed that Rufus Bishop had sold him the eastern quarter of the property in 1879, that there was a bill of sale to prove it, and that he had been patient long enough waiting for proper transfer of title. Emmett Dooley was 44 years old, shorter than Luther by half a foot but wider through the shoulders, with a red-brown beard that he kept trimmed with more vanity than most men in Palo Duro County would admit to. He ran the Dooley Ranch from a property 2 miles south, and where Luther ran cattle by sheer force and number, Emmett ran his operation on cunning and connections. He had the ear of the county commissioner and a friendship with the circuit judge that went back to a card game in Fort Griffin neither man discussed publicly. Emmett had arrived at Inez's door 3 days after Luther, equally polite, equally firm, and with his own document in hand. He claimed that Rufus Bishop had used the southern quarter of the property as collateral on a loan of $400 in 1880, had never repaid that loan, and that the land therefore had reverted to Emmett Dooley by lawful contract. Together, the two claims would have swallowed Inez's inheritance whole. She had gone to the county office in the town of Colton, 12 miles east, and found the records office presided over by a nervous little clerk named Harlan Metz, who sweated through his collar even in January, and who clearly already knew about the competing claims, because he could not meet her eyes when she walked through the door. The official deed on file showed Rufus Bishop as the legal owner of all 400 acres, but Harlan Metz explained, in the careful, apologetic voice of a man who has been told what to say, that competing contractual claims could supersede a deed depending on the specific legal language involved, and that the matter would need to be settled either in court or by negotiation. Court meant the circuit judge. The circuit judge was Emmett Dooley's friend. Negotiation meant choosing which of two hungry wolves would be allowed to eat you first. Inez had ridden back to Redemption Creek with her hands steady on the reins and her jaw set tight, and she had sat at her father's kitchen table that evening until the lamp burned low, going through every paper and letter and ledger she could find in the house. What she found was that her father had been a careful, private man. He had kept records of every cattle sale, every seed purchase, every payment made to the county for water rights. But she could find no record of any sale to Luther Crane, and no record of any loan from Emmett Dooley. What she found instead were references, vague but persistent, scattered through his letters and his personal diary, to a man her father trusted completely. Someone her father called simply the surveyor. Someone who had, apparently, witnessed and recorded things that Rufus Bishop considered important enough to mention, but private enough not to explain in detail. The surveyor had a name, written only once in the diary, in the cramped hand her father used when he was being careful. The name was Silas Covington. Inez had asked about Silas Covington in town the following morning, and had found the experience instructive. The woman behind the counter at the dry goods store had glanced up, started to answer, then looked toward the window and said only that she believed Mr. Covington sometimes passed through. The bartender at the Buckhorn had given a slow, noncommittal nod and said Covington was known in the area. The liveryman, old Chet Barrow, had been the most forthcoming, but even he had kept his voice low. Covington was a surveyor and a cartographer, Chet said. Had worked for the General Land Office out of Austin some years back. Not a man who sought attention, not a man who caused trouble, but not a man, either, that Chet would want to see crossed. He knows where everything is, Chet had said, which at the time Inez had taken as a compliment to the man's professional skills. She understood later that Chet had meant something considerably more specific. The trouble arrived in earnest on a Tuesday morning in early July, when Luther Crane's men began stringing fence wire along what Luther claimed was the new boundary of his property, cutting straight across the northeast corner of the Bishop land. There were 3 of them, big sunburned men with the casual confidence of people who do what they're told by someone powerful. Inez had ridden out on her gray mare and told them plainly to stop. The man in charge, a square-jawed hand named Tolliver, had touched his hat brim with polite insolence and told her that Mr. Crane's deed covered this ground, and she was welcome to take the matter up with the county if she disagreed. That same afternoon, 2 of Emmett Dooley's men appeared at her south pasture gate with a padlock and a chain, claiming that the southern quarter was now Dooley property pending legal resolution, and that she would need Emmett's permission to water her cattle at the creek that ran through it. Her cattle needed that creek. Without it, 40 head would begin suffering inside a week in July heat like this. She rode into Redemption Creek that evening with her temper barely contained, and she was tying her horse at the post outside the telegraph office when she nearly walked into a man coming the other direction on the boardwalk. She caught herself and stepped back, and the man did the same, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 more, lean in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors are lean, with sun-browned skin and dark eyes that were quiet and observant in a face that was not unkind. He was dressed plainly, canvas trousers and a collarless shirt, a worn leather vest with 2 pockets, and boots that had seen serious mileage. He carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder that clinked faintly when he moved, the sound of instruments, she thought, metal things that measured and recorded. He had a hat, a good one, pushed back slightly on his head in the manner of a man who has been reading or working closely at something and forgot to straighten it afterward. He said, "I beg your pardon, ma'am," and stepped to the side to let her pass. She said, "Are you Silas Covington?" He went very still just for a moment. Not frightened, she thought. More like a man who had been expecting something to happen and was marking the precise instant of its arrival. "I am," he said. "My name is Inez Bishop. My father was Rufus Bishop. He mentioned you in his papers." She watched his face. Something moved through it, something genuine. "You knew him." "I did," Silas said. "He was a good man. I was sorry to hear he passed. He passed in April." "March," she said. "March 14th." Silas nodded slowly, and she saw something in his expression that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who wishes he had done something sooner. "I heard late," he said. "I had been in New Mexico territory through the winter." "Mr. Covington," she said, "I need to speak with you. Both Luther Crane and Emmett Dooley are claiming pieces of my father's land, and I cannot find evidence in the county records or in my father's papers to refute them. My father's diary suggests you may know something about the property that I do not." Silas looked at her for a long moment in the failing evening light, with the sounds of Redemption Creek going on around them, horses and distant voices and the tinny notes of someone playing a piano badly inside the buckhorn. Then he said, "I expect we should talk somewhere private, not here on the street." They walked to the small hotel at the end of the main street, which had a parlor that was empty at this hour, and they sat across from each other at a table with a lamp between them, and Silas Covington told her what he knew. He had been surveying in Palo Duro County in the spring of 1880, he said, contracted by the General Land Office to do a boundary clarification on several properties in the eastern part of the county, where the original surveys from the 1870s had been imprecise. He had spent 2 weeks working in the area and had become acquainted with Rufus Bishop, who had invited him to stay and eat several evenings when the work brought him close to the Bishop Ranch. Rufus had been a careful man, Silas said, with a quiet dignity that he had obviously enjoyed. And Rufus had been worried. Luther Crane had been putting pressure on him since at least 1878, Silas said. Small pressures at first. Fences moved slightly in the night. Cattle found on Bishop land that somehow belonged to Crane. A water dispute resolved suspiciously in Crane's favor by a county official who had subsequently prospered. By 1880, Luther Crane had produced a bill of sale he claimed Rufus had signed over a drunken card game in Dooley's saloon, a bill of sale Rufus Bishop swore he had never signed. And Emmett Dooley had produced a loan document that Rufus swore he had never agreed to, though he admitted his signature looked persuasive on it. "I looked at both documents," Silas said. "I am not a lawyer, but I know land records, and I know what I saw when I went back to Austin and looked at the original county filings. The deed your father held was clean and unencumbered as of the date it was first filed. No subsequent instrument properly registered against it. Whatever Luther Crane has, and whatever Emmett Dooley has, neither of them went through proper legal channels to register a claim against the deed. A competing contract that has not been properly registered does not supersede a deed of record, not in Texas, not anywhere with a functioning land office." Inez leaned forward. "Then why has no one simply said that? Why has Harlan Metz at the county office not said that?" Silas's expression was careful and tired. "Because Luther Crane owns Harlan Metz's mortgage," he said. "And because Emmett Dooley is the sort of man who keeps careful notes about things he has seen and heard that other people would prefer remained private. The county office in Colton is not a neutral party in this." Inez sat back. She looked at her hands on the table, the hands of a woman who had been teaching children their letters 6 months ago and was now holding a ranch together by stubbornness and prayer. "My father's diary mentions you as someone he trusted," she said. "He wrote that you had taken something for safekeeping. He does not say what." Silas was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make her look up at his face. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and withdrew something, and set it on the table between them. It was an envelope, yellowed and worn at the folds, sealed with wax that had been pressed with a thumb rather than a seal. Written on the outside in her father's handwriting were the words, in trust with S. Covington for Inez if needed. Her throat tightened. She looked from the envelope to Silas. "He gave you this." "The last time I passed through," Silas said. "About 8 months before he died. He told me he was growing older and the troubles with Crane and Dooley were not resolving. He said he had a daughter in Amarillo who would inherit everything, and he wanted to make sure certain things reached her hands safely, because he did not trust the county office to hold them, and he did not trust leaving them in the house where men had been known to come through uninvited." His voice was steady, but there was a softness at its edges. "He described you very well," he said quietly. "He said you were steadfast." She took the envelope carefully, broke the seal, and opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was an affidavit, signed by Rufus Bishop and witnessed by 2 men whose names she did not recognize, stating clearly that he had never signed any bill of sale to Luther Crane, had never played cards with Luther Crane, and had specifically never transferred title or interest in any portion of his property to Crane or any Crane representative. The second was a similar affidavit regarding Emmett Dooley, equally clear, equally witnessed, stating that the loan document Dooley possessed was fraudulent, that Rufus Bishop had sought no loan from Dooley, and that any signature purporting to be his on such a document was a forgery. The third document was the one that made her breath catch entirely. It was the original deed of title, the 1874 filing, stamped and counterstamped with General Land Office seals, naming Rufus Alton Bishop as the sole and lawful owner of all 400 acres in full, with a surveyor's certificate attached, signed by one Silas Matthew Covington, licensed surveyor, State of Texas, certifying the boundaries as legally measured and recorded. "He had you certify the boundaries," she said. "In 1880, Silas confirmed. After the dispute with Crane began, he wanted a fresh, licensed survey on record, separate from the county records, in case those records were ever tampered with. The boundary certification is filed with the General Land Office in Austin, not with Palo Duro County. Colton cannot touch it." Inez looked at him across the lamp. The evening had deepened outside, and the noise from the buckhorn was louder now. She was aware of a feeling that she did not have a simple word for, the sensation of a knot loosening inside her chest that she had been holding so tight for so long she had stopped noticing the pain of it. Her father had been a careful man. He had seen this coming, and he had trusted the right person. "Mr. Covington," she said, "these documents need to be placed before the proper authority, a federal authority, not the county." "Yes," he said. "There is a land commissioner's circuit out of Fort Worth. The next session is in 10 days in Clarendon. If these documents are presented there, along with a formal complaint of fraudulent competing claims, the county records can be overridden and the federal filing stands." 10 days, she said. "Can I keep my cattle watered for 10 days with Dooley's men on my south pasture gate?" Silas's jaw tightened. "That," he said, "is the part we need to discuss." They talked for another hour, and then Inez rode home in the dark, her father's documents tucked inside her coat against her ribs. The night was warm and starred, the kind of sky the Panhandle produced as though making up for everything harsh it did during the daylight hours. Her gray mare moved with easy familiarity on the road she knew, and Inez rode with her hands loose on the reins and her mind working steadily through what Silas had told her and what it would take to survive the next 10 days. Silas Covington had offered to stay. He had offered it plainly, without any of the complicated social negotiation that the offer might have carried in a drawing room somewhere east. He had said, "I can camp on your north boundary and I can ride your fence line mornings, if that is useful to you." She had said yes, because it was useful and because she was a practical woman, and only later, riding home, did she notice that she had decided to trust him with very little actual deliberation, which was not like her. She put that thought away for the moment and concentrated on the problem at hand. The following morning brought Silas Covington to her door at sunrise with his horse and his bedroll and his canvas satchel of instruments, and she showed him where to settle his camp at the northwest corner of the property, near a stand of cottonwoods that gave reasonable shade. She brought him coffee from the house, and they stood by his small fire and reviewed what they knew. Luther Crane's men were still stringing fence on the northeast boundary. 3 men, working steadily, and Tolliver in charge of them. They had not yet trespassed properly, in the sense of coming to the house or threatening anyone directly, but they were establishing a physical fact on the ground that would complicate legal arguments if it remained. Emmett Dooley's 2 men were still at the south pasture gate. Inez had been letting her cattle drink from the north water tank, an earthen tank that her father had built, but in July heat it would not sustain 40 head much past the middle of the week. "I want a ride to the south pasture this morning," she said. Silas looked at her. "That is likely to provoke a response." "It will provoke a response because the response is already there," she said. "Dooley's men are on my land. They are preventing me from accessing water I am legally entitled to. I intend to go there and open that gate and water my cattle, and I intend to have a witness when I do it." He considered this for a moment, and she saw him working it through with the methodical patience of a man who liked to understand the complete shape of a problem before moving. Then he nodded once, finished his coffee, and saddled his horse. Emmett Dooley's men at the south gate were named Garrett and Hooks. Garrett was young, maybe 20 or 21, with a nervous energy that showed itself in the way he kept shifting his weight. Hooks was older, rangy, and watchful. Both of them were carrying rifles across their saddle bows, which was the calculated intimidation of men who have been told to make a point without being told explicitly to shoot anyone. Inez rode up to the gate and stopped her mare 6 feet back. "That gate belongs to the Bishop Ranch," she said clearly, "and I am opening it to water my cattle." Hooks said, without moving, "Mr. Dooley's instructions say this ground is under dispute and no unauthorized access." "This is not disputed ground," Inez said. "This is my property and you are blocking my access to it. I am going to ask you once politely to step aside." Hooks glanced at Silas, who had halted his horse slightly behind and to the right of Inez's mare, not close enough to crowd the confrontation, but close enough for Hooks to see that whatever happened would have 2 witnesses, and one of them was a man who looked like he had been in uncomfortable situations before and had come through them without becoming rattled. Silas said nothing. He simply sat his horse and watched with those quiet, steady eyes. Hooks and Garrett exchanged a look. Then Hooks pulled his horse back a step and Garrett moved aside, and Inez rode forward, leaned from her saddle and worked the chain off the gate with deliberate calm, pushing it open. She rode through. She did not look back at Hooks or Garrett. She rode to the creek bank and let her mare drink, and then she sat in the dappled shade of the cottonwoods for a long moment with her heart hammering against her stays. Because she was 24 years old and she was alone in the world, except for a surveyor she had met the previous evening, and for just a moment the weight of it all landed on her fully. Then she heard Silas's horse coming through the gate behind her, and she heard him dismount, and she heard him let his horse go to the water, and he came and stood near her without speaking for a moment, looking at the creek, at the way the light came through the cottonwood leaves and moved on the water. "You did that very well," he said finally. "I was terrified," she said, which surprised her because she did not generally say such things out loud. "I know," he said. "You did not show it, that is what mattered." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the creek with an expression of quiet appreciation, the way a man looks at something beautiful when he has seen enough rough country to know how rare beauty is. "You have been in the West a long time," she said. "Since I was 20, he said. "Started with the Land Office survey cruise out of Austin. Rode the survey of the Panhandle in 1876, part of it anyway. Before that I was in Hill County where I grew up. Family there." She asked, and felt that it was perhaps a question she might not have asked in a different setting, but they were standing at a creek that both of them had just asserted her right to be at, and formality seemed beside the point. "My mother," he said. She has a small farm. My father passed in 1874. He paused. I get back when I can. The work keeps me moving. She nodded. There was something in the way he said it, not complaint, not self-pity, just the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who has chosen a particular life and understood its costs without dramatizing them. She found she respected that enormously. They rode back to the house in the mid-morning warmth, and Inez began making the preparations she would need for the 10 days ahead. She wrote a formal letter to the Land Commissioner's Circuit Office in Clarendon, documenting the competing claims and announcing her intention to present evidence at the upcoming session. She wrote it at her father's desk with her father's pen, and she was careful and precise because she had learned from years of watching people underestimate paperwork that paperwork, done correctly, was its own kind of power. Silas took the letter to the telegraph office in town himself, which was the right move because Luther Crane had a man who sometimes loitered near the telegraph office when Crane had reason to be interested in correspondence going in or out, and Silas was not a person Luther Crane's man would recognize as connected to Inez Bishop. He sent the telegraph, collected the confirmation, and returned with a small bag of flour and dried beans from the dry goods store that Inez had asked him to pick up, because there was something economical about having him run the errand while he was already in town. She noticed when he came back that he had also brought a small paper bag with a handful of peppermint candies in it, which he set on her kitchen table without comment. It was such a small, thoughtful thing that she stood looking at it for a moment longer than she probably needed to. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch as the day cooled, which it did in the Panhandle evenings in a way that felt like a reprieve after the punishment of the afternoon heat. The sky went through its colors, the oranges and deep pinks, and then the blue-purple that settled over the grassland like a bruise becoming beautiful. Inez had brought her father's diary out, partly to review it for anything else relevant, and partly because sitting with it felt like company. Silas was going over his survey maps by the last of the light, large sheets of paper that he unrolled carefully across the porch railing, covered in the precise and patient notation of a man who understood that accuracy was the whole point. "My father wrote about you more than once," she said. Silas looked up. "He wrote that you reminded him of the kind of man he had hoped to meet more of when he came west," she said. "He came from Virginia, you know. He had romantic ideas about the frontier." She smiled at the page. "He found most of them were wrong, but a few were right. He said you were one of the right ones." Silas was quiet for a moment. The grassland moved in the evening breeze, that particular sound of the Panhandle, a soft, continuous whisper that went on in all directions. "He was generous to say so," he said. "I think of him as one of the people who made me believe this country was worth the trouble of measuring correctly." She looked at him, this man who measured things for a living, and thought about what that meant, the patience it required, the precision, the commitment to getting the true shape of something rather than just an approximation. There was something in it that she found she was thinking about in terms that had nothing particular to do with land surveying. She put the thought away again, more gently this time. On the third day, Luther Crane came himself. He arrived at mid-morning with Tolliver and 2 other riders, all of them mounted on good horses that made a point about resources. Luther Crane was exactly what he looked like from a distance, a man who had gotten large by taking up other people's space, who wore authority the way some men wore expensive boots, as a signal of position rather than a reflection of character. He rode to the front of the house and waited, which was the slightly more aggressive version of knocking, and Inez came out onto the porch with Silas standing just back of the doorway, where he could see and be seen. "Miss Bishop," Luther said, in a voice that was warm with the particular warmth of men who believe warmth is a tool, "I have heard you may be entertaining some notions about this property that are going to cause trouble for everyone involved, including yourself. I have come to see if we cannot arrive at a sensible accommodation before this goes somewhere uncomfortable." "Mr. Crane," Inez said, I have sent a letter to the Land Commissioner's Circuit. The matter will be heard in Clarendon in 7 days. Luther's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed warm. The Federal Land Office is a slow and complicated process, Miss Bishop. I have documents that show clearly a sale was made. I do not want to drag you through something unpleasant. What I propose is a fair cash settlement for the Northeast Quarter, a price that represents genuine market value, and we put this behind us. The Northeast Quarter, she said, is not for sale. It is my property, and it was never sold to you or anyone, and the documents you are relying on are fraudulent. I do not say that to be inflammatory. I say it because it is accurate and because I want you to understand that I know it. Luther looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Sela's in the doorway, and something changed in them, a sharpening, a reassessment. "Who is this?" he asked, not rudely but with a calculation that was not quite subtle. "Silas Covington," Silas said, "licensed surveyor. I certified the Bishop property boundaries in 1880. The certification is on file with the General Land Office in Austin. I will be presenting that filing along with certain additional documents to the Land Commissioner's Circuit in Clarendon." There was a silence. Tolliver's horse shifted. Luther Crane looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on was less solid than he believed. It was not defeat, not yet, but it was the first real moment of uncertainty, and Inez watched it happen and felt the first real loosening of the cold fear that had been sitting in her stomach for weeks. Luther Crane said nothing further of significance. He said they would speak again, in the way that powerful men say such things when they mean to make sure of it, and he turned his horse and rode away with his men. That evening, Emmett Dooley sent a messenger rather than coming himself, which told Inez something about how each man operated. The messenger was a polite young man who delivered a note in Dooley's own hand, suggesting that Inez might consider whether the stress and uncertainty of a federal proceeding was truly in her interest, and that Dooley was prepared to be generous in his settlement offer. She wrote back, in her own hand, that she intended no settlement, and that Mr. Dooley was welcome to present whatever documents he had before the Land Commissioner, where they would be examined on their merits. "Dooley is smarter than Crane," Silas said, when she told him about the note. They were at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, reviewing the documents again in preparation for the Clarendon session. "He knows what is coming, and he is trying to avoid the public examination. If his loan document is forged, and I believe it is, having it examined officially is a serious risk for him." "Then we make sure it gets examined," she said. "Yes," he said, and then after a pause that was careful, "Inez." It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up. "Your father gave me those documents because he trusted me," he said. "And he trusted me because I told him once when he asked that I believed a man's word was what he had that mattered most, and that the law, at its best, was supposed to support that. I want you to know that I will see this through with you. Not because of what your father asked, because it is right." She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the Panhandle night was doing its usual extravagant thing with stars. The lamp made warm light between them. "I know," she said, and meant it simply. On the 5th day, someone cut her north fence line. Silas found it on his morning ride, a clean cut through 3 strands of wire on the northern boundary, not a clean enough cut to have happened accidentally on a branch or a passing cow horn. Someone had used wire cutters and done it in the night. 4 of her cattle had gone through, wandering north onto what was technically open range but which was adjacent to land that Crane's men would be riding. She and Silas spent the morning finding the cattle and bringing them back, which was hot, frustrating work across scrubby grassland under a sun that had no mercy in it at all. "This is intimidation," she said, as they rode back with the last stray. "It is," he agreed. "It is also something we document. I want to take the measurements of that fence cut and make a written record tonight. If Crane's men did it, and I think they did, it is criminal interference with a property under dispute. The Land Commissioner will want to know." They documented it. Silas measured and recorded. Inez wrote the account in clear, precise language. She was learning that documentation was its own form of courage, the courage of making things undeniable. On the sixth day, something happened that was smaller and not related to the land dispute at all, except that it was related to everything else, in the way that small things are sometimes the actual story. Inez had been repairing the south fence gate, the one where Dooley's men had put the chain, replacing the old chain ring that had corroded and needed new hardware. She was working with a wrench, and the morning heat was already considerable, and she had pushed her sleeves up and was sitting on the gate's lower rail working at a bolt that was not cooperating. And she heard Silas come up behind her, and she said without turning, "I can manage it." He said, "I know you can," and handed her a different wrench, a smaller one with a different grip angle that was, in fact, better suited to the position of the bolt. She tried it, and the bolt turned and came free, and she looked at the wrench in her hand and then up at him. He was smiling. Not the broad, performed smile of a man trying to charm someone, but the quiet, private smile of a person sharing something small and good with another person. She felt it somewhere behind her ribs, that smile, in a way that she would think about afterward. "Where did you learn about wrenches?" she asked. "From a blacksmith in Weatherford who tried to teach me everything he knew in 6 months because he thought I was hopeless with tools," Silas said. "I suspect he would say I am still hopeless. But I know my wrench sizes." She laughed, actually laughed, which felt foreign and welcome both at once, and for a few minutes they talked about nothing in particular, about the blacksmith in Weatherford, and about the cattle she had bought in spring, and about whether the cottonwoods along the creek were as old as they looked. And then the morning moved on and they went back to work, and Inez spent the rest of the afternoon aware of a warmth in the vicinity of her chest that had nothing to do with the July heat. That evening she admitted to herself, with the directness she applied to other practical matters, that she had feelings for Silas Covington. This was, she acknowledged, a somewhat complicated situation. He was a man who traveled constantly by the nature of his work. She was a woman trying to establish herself on a piece of land in a county where the powerful had already demonstrated their intention to make her life difficult. The last thing she needed was to entangle her heart in something that could not be stable. She went to bed with that practical conclusion firmly in place, and lay awake for a considerable portion of the night not thinking about his smile. The day before the Clarendon session, Luther Crane made his second move. Inez had ridden to town to confirm some last details at the telegraph office, and she came back to find 2 of Crane's men, Tolliver included, at her front gate having what appeared to be a pointed conversation with Silas. She rode up and positioned her horse between them and Silas with deliberate calm. Tolliver said, without quite meeting her eyes, that Mr. Crane had heard a rumor that certain papers held by a certain individual might be considered the product of fraud themselves, given that the so-called surveyor's certification had been conducted without Crane's knowledge on land Crane had rights to, and that Crane's legal advisers were prepared to raise that question before the commissioner. Silas's voice, when he responded, was the quietest she had heard it, which was the opposite of what one might expect. When most men were angry, they got louder. Silas, she was learning, got quieter. "The survey was conducted by license of the General Land Office," he said, "on land belonging to Rufus Bishop, who commissioned it, which was his lawful right as the deed holder. There is no argument there that a lawyer can make into something real." Tolliver tried 2 more approaches, and Silas replied to both of them with the same quiet, irrefutable precision, not aggressive, not nervous, simply accurate. Eventually Tolliver and his companion left, and Inez let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "He is grasping," Silas said. "He is afraid," she said. "Yes," he looked at her. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" She lifted her chin. "I have been ready for quite some time," she said. They rode to Clarendon together at dawn, 12 miles on the open Panhandle road, with the sun coming up behind them and throwing their shadows long ahead, and the grassland golden on either side, and the sky, the extraordinary clear blue that the Panhandle produces in the early morning hours before the heat closes in. They did not talk much on the road. It was a companionable quiet, the kind that develops between people who have been working closely together through something difficult, where words are not necessary to convey that both of them are committed to the same direction. Clarendon in 1882 was a growing town, a bit more established than Redemption Creek, with a proper courthouse building and a hotel with 2 floors. The land commissioner's circuit was set up in the courthouse, and when Inez and Silas arrived, they found that Luther Crane and Emmett Dooley had both arrived before them, each with their lawyers. Luther had a man in a black coat named Fenwick who looked expensive and confident. Emmett Dooley had a younger attorney named Carr who looked sharp and slightly hungry. The proceeding was formal but not a full court hearing. It was a land commissioner's review, presided over by a federal land commissioner named Archibald Greer, who was a compact, gray-haired man with the permanently skeptical expression of someone who has been doing this work long enough to have seen every variety of creative land claim. He had 2 clerks with him, and a considerable stack of documents already on his table when the proceeding opened. Inez presented first, because she was the original deed holder and the complaint had been filed by her. She stood before Commissioner Greer, and she laid out the case cleanly, beginning with the original 1874 deed, proceeding through the 1880 boundary certification filed with the General Land Office in Austin, presenting both of her father's sworn affidavits, and concluding with the documentation of the fence cut and the padlocked gate. Silas testified in support, presenting his professional credentials, his record with the General Land Office, and the precise details of the 1880 survey and certification. He spoke clearly and specifically, and when Fenwick, Luther Crane's attorney, attempted to question whether the survey had been conducted without proper notification to adjacent landowners, Silas produced the notice records from the Austin filing, dated and stamped, showing that all adjacent landowners, including Luther Crane, had been given the required notification, and that Crane had raised no objection at the time. Luther Crane's attorney presented the bill of sale. Commissioner Greer examined it at length and then asked Fenwick, who had witnessed the signature. Fenwick named a man who had died in 1881. Greer asked for the original, not a copy. Fenwick produced a document that was represented as the original. Greer spent several minutes examining it, and then asked if Crane had any documentation of the cash payment the bill of sale claimed had been made. Fenwick said there was a record of a withdrawal from Crane's banking account on the approximate date. Greer asked what approximate meant in a legal instrument. Fenwick began to look less comfortable. Emmett Dooley's attorney presented the loan document. Commissioner Greer examined it and then, with the patience of a man who has done this many times, asked Carr whether Mr. Dooley could produce any record of the $400 having been disbursed, any bank draft, any receipt, any letter acknowledging the transfer of funds. Carr said that the document itself constituted evidence of the transaction. Greer said that a document constituted evidence of a document being created, and asked again for supporting financial records. Carr did not have them. Greer then put down both documents and looked at both attorneys over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has been patient and is now going to stop being patient. He said that both claims exhibited fundamental evidentiary deficiencies. He said that the original deed of record was clear, and the General Land Office certification filed by a licensed surveyor in good standing was equally clear. He said that competing contractual claims to override a deed of record required not only the contract itself, but registration with the proper land office within the legally mandated period, and that neither Crane nor Dooley had filed any such registration. He said, finally, that the fraudulent appearance of both documents was a matter he was referring to the county district attorney for criminal investigation, with particular attention to the question of whether the signatures on both documents had been properly obtained. He ruled in Inez Bishop's favor on all counts. The 400 acres remained entirely hers. The room was quiet for a moment after he spoke. Then Luther Crane said something under his breath that no one was meant to hear, and pushed back from his chair and walked out. Emmett Dooley sat very still for a moment and then stood with careful dignity and left without speaking. Their attorneys gathered papers with the practiced calm of professionals absorbing a loss they would process later. Inez stood with her hands folded at her waist, and she looked at Silas, who was beside her, and she found that she could not immediately produce words that were adequate to the moment. So she simply looked at him. He looked back at her, and the quiet, private smile was there again. "Your father would have been very pleased," he said. She pressed her lips together for a moment and nodded, because the mention of her father hit her with the full weight of everything she had been holding and managing and not fully feeling for the past 6 months, the grief that she had been storing in a practical box and reopening only in small amounts when she could afford to. And for a moment her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said, "he would have." They rode home in the afternoon heat, and the 12 miles of Panhandle Road had a different quality in this direction, lighter somehow, though the sun was just as fierce and the road was just as dry. They talked, on the ride back, in a different way than they had talked before, more openly, with less of the focused, purposeful quality that the urgency of the past 10 days had imposed on everything. Silas told her about the country he had surveyed, New Mexico territory and the high desert, the Llano Estacado in the winter when it was something otherworldly, the river country farther east. He told it well, with an economy of language that suggested he was accustomed to communicating accurately and did not embellish for effect. She told him about teaching school in Amarillo, about the particular experience of watching a child understand something for the first time, the way it showed on a face before the child even knew it was showing. She told him about her father's letters, which had come every few weeks, always beginning with a description of the weather and the state of the grass, which told you more about how the ranch was doing than any explicit report, and which she had saved every one of. He wrote once, she said, that he had met a young surveyor who reminded him that the land was older than any of the arguments people were having over it. He said that gave him patience. Silas was quiet for a moment. "I think I said something like that," he said. "We were standing on the south boundary watching a hawk hunt over the grassland, and he said the whole business with Crane was exhausting him, and I said something along those lines. That the land did not particularly care about the argument. It would be here after all of us." He kept that thought, she said. "I am glad," he said, and his voice had a quality she was beginning to recognize, a genuine softness beneath the composure. They arrived home in the late afternoon, and there was still light enough to ride the boundary line, which they did together, checking the fence work that Crane's men had done and noting what would need to be taken down and what could be left in place. The fence they had strung was on Inez's land, which meant technically it was her fence now, and some sections of it were actually decent work and would be worth keeping as part of her proper boundary line. They marked the portions that needed to come down and estimated the materials. At the south gate, the chain that Dooley's men had put there was still in place, and Inez removed it herself, rolling it up and setting it beside the post. She opened the gate and left it open. Her cattle would come through on their own when they were ready. That evening, Silas made supper. He had, it emerged, a practical competence with a cook stove, the sort of skill developed by years of feeding himself in the field, and he produced a meal from what was available in the kitchen that was considerably better than what Inez would have made from the same materials. She sat at the table and watched him work, and felt the peculiar luxury of not being alone in the kitchen for the first time since she had come to the ranch. After supper they sat on the porch again, as had become their custom, and the evening was beautiful in the way that evenings in July in the Panhandle are beautiful when they are not threatening violence, All that space and all those stars and the grassland settling into its nighttime sounds. Inez had brought her father's diary out of habit and found she was not reading it, just holding it and looking at the sky. "What will you do now?" she asked. "With the case resolved." Silas was quiet for a moment. She could feel him considering the question, not the easy social surface of it but the actual substance. "I have a contract in New Mexico territory in September," he said. "Boundary clarification work near Socorro." He paused. "That is 6 weeks from now." "6 weeks," she said. "Yes, a beat. That is if I go." She looked at him. He was looking at the grassland the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. "Silas," she said, and his name felt natural in her mouth now. He turned to look at her. In the lamplight from the doorway, his face was entirely serious, open in the way that faces are when a person has decided to stop managing their expression and just let it be. "I do not want to presume," he said. "I have been here 10 days, and the circumstances have been somewhat extraordinary. I understand that what a person feels in the middle of a difficult situation is not always what they feel once the situation resolves." "That is true," she said. "And it is also true that who a person is in the middle of a difficult situation is considerably more reliable information than who they are at a dinner party." He looked at her for a long moment. "What is it that you want?" he asked. It was the question in its simplest form, asked with genuine attention, with the careful respect of someone who understood that the answer was hers and he would wait for it. She thought about it honestly, because that was the only way she thought about things. She thought about the ranch, the 400 acres her father had loved and protected and left to her. She thought about her students in Amarillo, who had probably already been replaced by another teacher who was young and willing. She thought about the evenings on this porch and the weight of being alone in a world that was not always gentle to women who were alone. And she thought about the small, exact happiness of working alongside someone who brought the right wrench and did not explain why, just handed it to you. "I want to stay on this land," she said. "I want to build what my father started and I want to do it well. And I would very much like not to be alone while I do it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not certain those are all achievable by September," Silas said. "The contract in New Mexico can be declined. There are other contracts. There is always work in Texas." "You would stay?" she asked. "If you would have me," he said. And then, with a small, careful movement, he reached across the arm of his chair and covered her hand with his, the way people do when words are sufficient but touch is more complete. His hand was warm and certain, and she turned hers over and took hold of it. "I would have you," she said. They sat like that for a while, in the enormity of that ordinary evening, with the Panhandle night doing its extravagant thing around them. In the weeks that followed, life on the Bishop Ranch found its new shape. Silas sent word to the Socorro contractor that he was unavailable and made no particular apology for it. He had already drawn more detailed maps of the Bishop property's boundaries than had ever existed before, partly out of professional habit, and partly because he believed that the more thoroughly documented a thing was, the harder it was to attack. He filed additional copies with the county office in Colton, now staffed by a different clerk after Harlan Metz quietly resigned, and with the General Land Office in Austin, and with the Land Commissioner's office in Fort Worth. He was thorough in the way of a man who had seen what happened when people trusted that a single record would be enough. Luther Crane's fence wire was taken down from the northeast boundary by Crane's own men within 2 weeks of the Clarendon ruling, without ceremony or further comment. Whatever Crane's attorney had told him about the prospects of a criminal investigation had apparently been sufficient to motivate compliance. Luther Crane himself was not seen at the Bishop Ranch again, and in town he was no longer the man he had been before. The slight deflation of a powerful man who has been publicly demonstrated to be less powerful than he believed was visible in the way he walked the main street of Redemption Creek. Emmett Dooley was a more complicated case. The county district attorney, a man named Pryor who had apparently been waiting for an opportunity that did not put him in political danger, opened an investigation into the loan document within 3 weeks of the commissioner's referral. Emmett Dooley spent considerable effort in the following months managing his connections and his reputation, and ultimately the investigation produced an indictment on one count of fraudulent instrument creation, to which Dooley eventually pleaded and was fined a substantial sum. He did not go to prison, which perhaps was not justice in its purest form, but he lost the ear of the circuit judge, who did not associate himself with an indicted man, and he lost the quiet confidence that had been his primary tool, and the Dooley Ranch over the following years shrank as properties sometimes do when the man running them stops believing he can simply take what he wants. Deacon Price, Luther Crane's man whose only job had been making people understand that Crane was not to be disagreed with, left the county entirely in August. Nobody much noted the departure. The Bishop Ranch had a good late summer. The July heat broke in August and there were rains that came up from the south and turned the grassland a bright, relieved green, and the cattle that had been stressed through the long dry weeks began to recover condition. Inez hired 2 hands, brothers named Ford and Amos Tully from a family that had been working ranch land in the county for years, and they were capable men who did the work without drama and respected the fact that they worked for a woman because they had grown up working for their mother, and understood that competence was not a question of who was asking. Silas, meanwhile, had begun taking smaller local survey contracts, boundary work and plat mapping for new properties coming into the county, the sort of steady, quiet work that kept him useful and active without taking him away. The General Land Office had, after a tactful approach from the Land Commissioner's office, offered him a part-time consulting position in the Panhandle district, reviewing contested surveys and certifications, which suited him in terms of both his skills and his preference for staying put. He had moved from his camp at the Cottonwoods to one of the rooms in the ranch house that Inez had prepared for a proper tenant when she first took over the property, with complete propriety, and the entirely practical justification that camping in July and August in the Texas Panhandle was genuinely uncomfortable, and there was a perfectly adequate room with a good roof going empty. The Tully brothers had the bunkhouse. Nobody in Redemption Creek was particularly inclined to make a moral drama out of the arrangement, because the story of what had happened at the Land Commissioner's hearing had circulated through the community and opinion had settled broadly in Inez Bishop's favor, and anyone who had opinions about what a young woman who had successfully defended her property from 2 corrupt landowners chose to do in the arrangement of her household was welcome to keep those opinions to themselves. There was a Sunday in September, when the first edge of autumn was in the air, that Inez would remember for the rest of her life as the day certain things became entirely clear. She had been in the south pasture, checking the fence the Tully brothers had repaired along the boundary, and Silas had come to find her because the light was going and supper would be cold if she stayed out much longer. He had ridden up, and she had been sitting on the fence rail looking at the creek, at the cottonwoods along its bank with their leaves just beginning to think about turning, and she had been thinking about her father and the way he had loved this place with a persistence that had ultimately proven to be its own kind of strength. Silas had dismounted and come to lean on the fence beside her, not saying anything yet, just coming to where she was. The evening was quiet with the particular quiet of autumn beginning, a holding of breath before the change. "He would have liked you," she said, "very much." "I would have been honored to know him better," Silas said. She looked at him. "I am glad you are here," she said, "not just for the land, for all of it." He turned to look at her, and the evening light was that amber September light that makes everything look like it has been chosen for it. And she thought that if she were the sort of person who believed in things being arranged by something larger than coincidence, she would find considerable evidence in the sequence of events that had led a dead man's trusted surveyor to be standing at a fence rail with his hand near hers on an autumn evening in the Texas Panhandle. She reached out and took his hand, and he wrapped his fingers around hers, and they stood there watching the light move on the water until the first star appeared. He asked her to marry him in October, on the porch, in the early evening, with the manner of a man who had thought about it carefully and was now ready to say it plainly, which was the only way he ever did anything. He told her that he loved her, which by this point was not news to either of them but was good to say out loud, and that he wanted to share this land and this life with her, and that he understood what she had built and what she intended to build, and he wanted to help her build it. He did not have a ring, because he had not been in a town with a proper jeweler and had not wanted to wait. She told him she did not need a ring, and she said yes with the same directness she would have used to accept a good offer on a cattle price, except that her voice was not quite steady, and she was smiling in a way that she suspected was not dignified and did not care at all. They were married in November, in the Redemption Creek Church, which was a small building with painted wood floors and narrow windows that let in long rectangles of winter light. The minister was a young man named Holloway who was earnest and kind, and performed the ceremony with evident feeling. Ford and Amos Tully were present. Old Chet Barrow, the liveryman, was there, the one who had first told Inez about Sila's as someone who knew where everything was. A scattering of townspeople came, because Inez had become known in Redemption Creek as the young woman who had stood up to Crane and Dooley both, and people wanted to wish her well. Silas's mother, whose name was Cora, had made the journey from Hill County, a long journey for an older woman, but she had come without being asked twice, and she sat in the front pew with her Sunday dress and her steady, warm eyes, and cried quietly when her son said his vows with an expression of absolute certainty and seriousness that told Cora everything she needed to know about what this was. Inez had no family present. Her mother had died when she was 12. She had an aunt somewhere in Virginia she had never met. It was a solitude she had carried for a long time, and she felt it particularly in the church, the way an absence makes itself felt most clearly when you are aware of being surrounded by love. But then Cora Covington took her hand during the reception and held it warmly and said, "I am very glad to know you," and the solitude shifted a little, the way a weight does when someone takes part of it. The winter was cold, as Panhandle winters are, a cold that comes down from the north without apology and settles over the grassland for months. But the ranch house was solid, and the stove was good, and the Tully brothers knew cattle work in cold weather, having grown up doing it. The ranch did well through the winter, better than expected, because Sila's turned out to have a systematic approach to herd management that complemented Inez's instinctive understanding of the animals themselves, and together they kept the losses to almost nothing. He had set up his drafting table in the front room, and in the evenings when the winter was too dark and cold for outside work, he would be at the table with his instruments and his maps, the lamp making a warm island of light while Inez read or wrote letters or did the ranch accounts, and they would talk in the comfortable way of two people who have settled into the habit of each other and find it entirely satisfying. He told her things about the land, about the way the survey work had taught him to see the country not as scenery but as information, the way the lay of the ground told you where the water would be and where it had been and what the land could sustain. She taught him, without quite meaning to listen to the cattle in the way her father had listened to them, to read the small signals of health and distress and contentment that a good rancher carries in the back of their awareness like a second consciousness. In the spring of 1883, Inez found out she was expecting a child. She told Sila's on a morning in March, standing in the kitchen with the coffee just made, with a directness that was characteristic of her, and that she had no particular reason to set aside for something so important. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child. I am fairly certain. I will confirm it with the doctor in Colton next week." He set down his coffee cup very carefully, and then he looked at her with an expression that she had no complete word for, the expression of a man who has not been fully prepared for a joy of this specific size, and is discovering, in real time, that he is entirely equal to it. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands gently and pressed his forehead to hers for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I am glad," which was the most understated possible way of conveying what was on his face, and she laughed and he laughed, and it was very much a morning in the ranch house of two people who had found each other by the most improbable and lucky series of circumstances. The doctor in Colton confirmed it. Inez was healthy and the pregnancy was proceeding normally, and the doctor, who had been practicing in the Panhandle for 8 years and had seen most varieties of human circumstance, said that she was one of the strongest-looking young women he had seen in his clinic, and he expected no complications. She continued working the ranch at a modified pace, because she was not a person who stopped working, but she was sensible about the nature of that modification and did not attempt to do things that were unwise. Silas watched over her with a protective attentiveness that was not smothering but that she noticed and appreciated, the way he would simply be where she was when there was heavy work, not taking it over, just being present in case of need. The summer of 1883 was gentler than the summer of 1882, or perhaps it simply seemed so because the land dispute was resolved, and the seasons felt like seasons again rather than events to be survived. The grassland grew well. The cattle were fat and content. The ranch was expanding carefully, the way Inez had always meant it to expand, not by aggression or acquisition, but by improvement and good management, building the quality of what was already there. The Tully brothers had become fixtures of the place. Ford, the older one, had a gift for breaking young horses that was genuinely remarkable to watch, a patience and a lightness of hand that the horses responded to with trust. Amos was the mechanic of the two, able to repair anything from a pump to a windmill to a wagon axle with the same unhurried competence. They ate supper at the ranch house every Sunday, a habit that had started as a practical matter and become something warmer over the winter months. Cora Covington came in September, ostensibly for a visit but practically because she wanted to be there for the final weeks. She was a woman of quiet capability, Silas's mother, and she took over the kitchen with a tactful efficiency that Inez surrendered gratefully. And she and Inez developed an easiness together that was not like mother and daughter, but was something in the same general neighborhood. The child was born in October 1883, a boy, who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with considerable energy and announcement, and was placed in Silas Covington's arms by the doctor from Colton, who had driven out for the occasion. Silas stood holding his son with the expression of a man who is discovering, for the first time, that there are sizes of feeling he had not previously known existed. The child had dark eyes and a full head of dark hair and the expression, common to newborns, of someone who has considerable opinions about the world and is not yet prepared to articulate them. They named him Rufus Silas Covington. The Rufus was for the man who had loved this land first, and for the trust he had placed in the right person, and for the careful, patient love that had reached forward through an envelope in a dead man's trust to protect the daughter he adored. The Silas was because the child would know, growing up, that his father had come to this land for what was right and had stayed for love, and that those were not separate things. Cora wept with joy and held the baby with the confident competence of someone who had held babies before. Ford and Amos Tully came to the door of the ranch house that evening with their hats in their hands and their faces entirely unable to contain their delight. And Inez told them to come in and sit down, and Cora gave them coffee, and the evening had the quality of a family, which was what it was. The months that followed were the kind of months that are made of small and daily things, the morning rounds and the evening check, and the sound of a baby discovering his own voice, and the particular light in Silas's eyes when he came into the kitchen to find Inez at the table with Rufus on her knee and her morning coffee in her hand, doing the accounts with one hand and holding the child with the other with an efficiency that seemed to him to perfectly summarize everything he loved about her. Silas continued his surveying work, mostly local now, a map here and a boundary clarification there, enough to keep his license current and his skills sharp, and to contribute to the county's understanding of its own geography. He was developing, over time, a reputation as the most reliable certifier in the Panhandle district, a man whose measurements were trusted absolutely, and periodically the General Land Office in Austin sent him cases from other counties where disputed surveys needed an independent professional opinion. It was satisfying work, the kind that allowed him to feel useful at a fundamental level, because the accuracy of the land records was not an abstract good. It was the difference between families keeping their homes and losing them, and he had seen enough of the wrong outcome to understand the value of the right one. The criminal case against Emmett Dooley moved through the system over the following year with the slowness characteristic of Texas judicial proceedings, and when it concluded in early 1884 with the fine and the public record of the indictment, Inez felt not triumph exactly, but a completion, the closing of a ledger that had been open since before her father's death. She sat at his desk the evening the news came through, and she wrote in the journal she had started keeping, in his tradition, a brief entry noting the date and the outcome, and then a line that was not really about Dooley at all. She wrote, "The land is clear and the records are true, and we have built something worth having here. Father would say this is what patience looks like after a long time." Luther Crane lived on and continued to run his cattle operation, diminished and more careful, and he and Inez had a civil but entirely cool relationship for the remaining years of his life, two people who understood precisely what had been done, and who had one and who were equally disinclined to revisit the conversation. Tolliver moved on to work for another outfit east of the county. Deacon Price was reportedly in New Mexico, and nobody much cared about that. By the spring of 1885, the Bishop Covington Ranch, as people in Redemption Creek had taken to calling it, was one of the better regarded operations in Palo Duro County. Not the largest, not by considerable distance, but managed with the kind of attentive care that showed in the quality of the cattle and the condition of the fences, and the fact that the wells were deep, and the water tanks were maintained, and the grass was not overgrazed because Inez had inherited her father's understanding that the land was a partner, not just a resource, and you treated a partner with respect if you expected the partnership to last. They had a second child in the summer of 1885, a girl this time, with Silas's quiet eyes and Inez's stubborn set of jaw, who arrived in July with somewhat less drama than her brother and who, from the beginning, had the manner of someone who would be in charge of something when she grew up, and was simply waiting for the appropriate opportunity. They named her Clara Annette Covington, Clara for no particular family reason except that it suited her, and Annette for Cora's own mother, which made Cora cry again, which seemed to be a reliable response to most of the significant events of this family's life, and which nobody minded. Rufus, not yet 2, regarded his sister with initial suspicion that gave way, over the following weeks, to a proprietary affection that would characterize their relationship for years to come. He was not always successful at sharing, but he was always, in the end, protective, which Inez thought was a quality that could be shaped into something good. Cora visited twice a year now, and the Tully brothers had become a permanent part of the life of the place. Ford had, in 1884, married a woman named Patience from a family in the northern part of the county, and she had joined the Sunday suppers with a warmth and a practical good sense that fit easily into the established rhythm. Amos remained happily and apparently permanently uninterested in any particular woman, and occupied himself instead with his mechanical projects and his considerable reading, which he did with the deep attention of a man who regards books as the most interesting company available to him. On a Sunday evening in late September of 1885, when the children were asleep, and the ranch house was quiet with the particular peace of a place that is well managed and well loved, Inez and Silas sat on the porch the way they always did when the evening allowed, and the Panhandle gave them one of its tremendous autumn skies, all stars and immensity, and the grassland moved in the cool air with the whisper that had become the background of all their evenings. "I think about what this land looked like when my father first staked it," she said. "The way he described it in his letters, he said it looked like something that had been waiting a long time to be found." "That is a good way to put it," Silas said. She looked at the sky. "And I think about the year I came out here after he died with his papers and his cattle and no idea what was coming, the fences and the gates and the lawyers and the commissioner's hearing. And the surveyor nobody noticed," Silas said quietly, and she heard in his voice the slight private humor of a man who has accepted his role in the story without any great need to correct the record. She looked at him. "I noticed," she said. He smiled. The quiet, private smile that she had first seen across a lamp in a hotel parlor and had spent 3 years watching become the thing she recognized most immediately as home. He reached for her hand as he had from the beginning, and she gave it to him as she had then. "I know you did," he said. Below them the creek moved through the south pasture in the dark, the same creek that Emmett Dooley's men had tried to lock away from her, running freely over its stones as it always had, as it would when all of them were gone and the land remained. The cottonwoods stood along its banks. The cattle settled in the pasture. The children breathed in their beds. The stars were everything above them, the full and extravagant generosity of the Panhandle sky. Silas Covington, who had measured this land and kept its secrets and come back to it, because something in him understood that it was where he was supposed to be, sat beside Inez Bishop Covington and looked out at the 400 acres that had been fought over and protected and loved across years by people who believed that what was true on a piece of paper and what was true on the ground ought to correspond, and that it was worth considerable effort to make sure they did. Inez Bishop Covington, who had come back to her father's land in grief and found herself standing in the path of 2 powerful men who had counted on her having nothing left, sat with her husband's hand in hers and thought about her father's diary and the name written carefully in it, the name of a man her father trusted, the man nobody else had thought to look for. The deed had been safe all along, folded inside trust instead of a boot, carried by a man who came back when she needed him. The land was hers. The life was theirs, every fence line measured and true. And in the morning there would be coffee and cattle and children and the long particular beauty of another day on the Panhandle, and that was, she thought, exactly enough. More than enough. Everything.